The boy had not eaten in 3 days. This was the thing the blacksmith told her on the platform, quietly, while her trunk sat between them in the October dust and the train pulled away behind her. He did not say it to alarm her. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been carrying alone long enough that the weight of it has changed shape. Not lighter, just different. She had come from Selena on a Wednesday. The advertisement had been plain. Widower. One child, age 7. Small house near the forge. Looking for a capable woman willing to manage a household. Room and board. Wages discussed on arrival. She had read it twice and then folded it into her coat pocket, where it stayed until she stepped off the train. The town was called Grover's Flat. One main street, one water trough, a general store with a porch that needed leveling. The trees along the road had gone yellow and were just beginning to drop. She noticed a woman watching from the general store window and did not look away from her. The woman did. The blacksmith was 34, broad through the shoulders, careful in his movements. He wore a clean shirt for the platform, which she noticed and did not comment on. His hands were the kind of hands that had done real work for a long time. Knuckles thickened, a scar along the left thumb that had healed white. He picked up her trunk without asking. She walked beside him. He told her about the boy on the way to the house. 7 years old. His mother had died in February. Fever, fast. The boy had been eating fine through spring and summer, and then sometime in September he had simply stopped. Not all at once. A little less at breakfast, pushing supper around the plate. The blacksmith had tried everything he knew, which he admitted was not much. She listened without interrupting. The house was at the end of a short road behind the forge. 2 rooms on the ground floor, a loft above. A wood stove in the kitchen that was going but barely. She could smell iron in the air from the forge next door. The porch had a loose step, the second one, and she felt it give under her boot as she went up. The boy was sitting at the kitchen table. He was small for 7, or perhaps he only looked that way because he was so still. His hands were in his lap. He had his father's coloring, dark hair, pale eyes that picked up what light there was. And he watched her come through the door with an expression that was not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something practiced. The blacksmith set her trunk by the wall. The boy did not speak. She looked at the stove, the empty pot on the hook, the scant wood beside the door, and then she looked at the boy again. She said, "I'll need more wood than this." The blacksmith looked at the woodpile like he was seeing it for the first time. He said he'd get more from the stack behind the forge and was gone before she'd taken off her coat. She stood in the kitchen and took inventory the way she'd learned to take inventory, without moving, just looking. The pot was cast iron, good weight, a crack in the handle repaired with wire. The shelf above the stove held salt, a small jar of lard, nothing else. A sack of cornmeal on the floor against the wall, tied but not full. A basket of onions, half of them gone soft. The boy had not moved. She hung her coat on the hook by the door. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow and opened the firebox on the stove. The fire was down to coals. Barely enough. She fed it 2 pieces from the scant pile beside the door and left the box open to draw. Then she turned and looked at the boy directly. He looked back. His hands were still in his lap. She said, "Those onions on the floor, can you tell me which ones are still good?" He didn't answer right away. She didn't fill the silence. After a moment, he slid off the chair and went to the basket. He crouched in front of it and began pressing each onion in turn, setting the soft ones aside in a small, careful row. He worked slowly, seriously, like it was a task that deserved seriousness. She watched him for a moment, then went to find the water bucket. It was on the porch, empty. She took it to the pump at the side of the house and worked the handle until the water ran clear. The air was cold enough that her breath showed. Somewhere in the forge, she could hear the blacksmith moving, the drag of wood on packed earth. When she came back inside, the boy had sorted the onions. 5 good ones, 3 soft, arranged in 2 separate groups with the precision of someone who wanted to do the thing right. She set the bucket on the stove and said, "Good, that's exactly right." He looked at the onions, not at her. She began peeling. The knife she found in the drawer was dull, which she noted without comment. She worked around it. The onions went into the pot with the lard, and the sound of them hitting the hot iron was the first warm sound the kitchen had made all evening. The boy climbed back onto his chair. He watched her hands. She didn't speak again, and neither did he. But when the blacksmith came back with the wood and stacked it beside the door and looked at the pot and then at his son, something shifted in the room that none of them named. The boy's hands, she noticed, were now on the table. The blacksmith set the last piece of wood against the wall and straightened. He was looking at the pot, not at her, at the pot, the way a man looks at something he does not trust himself to hope about yet. She asked him, without turning around, where he kept the salt. He crossed to a shelf above the dry goods and brought down a small clay crock, set it on the table beside her. She took a pinch between two fingers, felt it, took another, added both to the pot and stirred once with the handle of a spoon that had been left in the pot. The onions had gone soft and pale. The smell had changed the room. She asked if there was any dried meat. He went to the back cupboard and came out with a cloth-wrapped bundle, maybe half a pound of something dark and stiff. She unwrapped it on the table, pressed it with her thumb, cut it into pieces with the dull knife. It took longer than it should have. She did not say anything about that either. The pieces went into the pot and she added water from the bucket. Not all of it, just enough. The boy had not moved. His hands were still flat on the table, one on either side of where the onions had been. He was watching her work the way she had seen children watch things that interested them before they knew they were interested. She did not look at him too directly. She had learned that already. The blacksmith stayed in the kitchen. She had half expected him to leave, to go back to the forge or find something that needed his hands elsewhere. But he didn't. He pulled out the chair at the far end of the table and sat in it with his elbows on his knees, and he stayed, not talking, not doing anything, just present in the room the way a person is when they have decided that the room is where they should be. The fire had caught properly now. She could feel it on the side of her face. She found a second pot under the counter and used the rest of the water to rinse it out, then set it on the edge of the stove to warm for washing. Small thing. No one would notice it or thank her for it. It was just the next useful thing, and she did it. The stew would need another 20 minutes at least, maybe 30. The meat was very dry. She turned to ask if he had any flour and caught the boy watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Not the guarded thing from before, not quite suspicion. Something else, something that had not made up its mind yet. He looked away quickly. She found the flour herself, in a tin near the door, and began to measure out a small amount into her palm. She worked the flour into a loose dough with water and a pinch of salt. No board to roll it on, just her palms and the edge of the counter. She had done it 100 times in worse kitchens than this. The boy watched her hands without pretending not to, and she did not make anything of it. The man at the far end of the table had not moved. She shaped the dough into small rounds, flattened them with the heel of her hand, and laid them along the rim of the stove where it was hot enough to cook them through slowly. Not bread, not biscuits exactly. Something between the two that her own mother had made when the flour was running low and the week was running long. She had not made them since. She did not think about that. The stew had begun to breathe, a low, steady bubble from beneath the lid. She lifted it, stirred once, replaced it. The dried meat had softened enough that the broth had thickened a little. Not much, but some, the boy said. What are those? She did not turn around. Something to eat with the stew. A silence. Then, they look wrong. They'll look better cooked. She heard him shift on the bench, not away. Sideways, which was different. The small rounds had begun to brown along their undersides. She turned them one at a time with two fingers, quick, the way you learn to move near heat without thinking about it. The kitchen had warmed considerably now. She could feel it in her shoulders. The way cold had been sitting in them since the platform, and was only just letting go. The man stood up. She heard him cross to the water bucket, lift the ladle, drink from it, set it back. Then he came and stood at the other end of the counter, not close, not far, and looked at what she was doing with the same quiet attention he had probably given to 100 things that needed assessing before they could be. Trusted. She moved 2 of the rounds to the edge of the stove to finish and began stirring the stew again. He said, "Where'd you learn that?" "My mother." He looked at the rounds. He did not say anything else. The boy had gotten up from the bench. He was standing now in the space between the table and the stove, 3 feet back, arms at his sides, not asking, not leaving, just existing in the room differently than he had been. Closer than before. He had not decided anything yet. She could see that, but he was there. She lifted one of the rounds off the stove and set it on the edge of the counter nearest him, not offering it directly, just placing it where it could be reached if a person wanted to reach for it. She turned back to the stew. She kept her eyes on the pot. The stew had thickened in the last few minutes and needed watching now, the kind of watching that gives a person an excuse to stay turned away. She dragged the wooden spoon through the bottom, felt the resistance, adjusted the pot a half-inch off the direct heat. Behind her, she heard nothing. Then the small dry sound of a hand touching the counter's edge. She did not turn around. She moved the second round slightly, just a small adjustment, the same way she might tend to anything in the ordinary course of work. Her back stayed to him. The fire in the stove made its low, patient sound. A pause. Another one after that. Then the sound of him picking it up. She let out a breath through her nose and did not make anything of it. The man at the far end of the counter had gone very still. She could feel it without looking. The particular stillness of someone watching something they had stopped expecting to see. He did not speak. Whatever was happening in him, he kept it where it belonged, which was inside, where it could settle at its own pace. She ladled stew into the 2 bowls she had already set out and carried them to the table. Set the spoon beside one, moved the salt, sat down. After a moment, the man crossed the room and sat across from her. The boy had drifted sideways. Still standing, still holding the round in both hands. He had taken one bite. She could see the torn edge of it from where she sat. He was looking at the table, then at the bowls, then at nothing she could identify. She broke a piece from her own bread and dipped it in the stew, without comment. The man picked up his spoon. The boy moved to the bench, slowly, the way a person moves when they are trying not to be noticed moving. He sat. He held the round in his lap. He did not pick up a spoon. But he was at the table now, and the room had reorganized itself around that fact in a way she could not have forced and did not try to. They ate. The fire settled. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it find the gap under the door and press through. The candle on the counter bent once and straightened. The boy ate the rest of the round in 4 bites, not looking up. She rose and ladled a small bowl of stew and set it near him on the table, between his hands and the edge, close enough to reach if a person decided to reach. She sat back down. She did not look at him to see what he would do with it. She looked at the candle instead, which had straightened again and was burning without any trouble now, thin and even in the still air of the room. The boy reached for the bowl. She did not see it happen. She kept her eyes on the candle, the way she had told herself she would, and she heard the small scrape of ceramic against the table, and then the sound of a spoon finding liquid. That was all. She did not move. She did not let anything change in her face or her posture. She picked up her own spoon and finished the last of her stew, and the fire popped once behind the grate, and the wind pressed at the door again and then let go. The man ate without looking up either. The 3 of them sat like that, not comfortable, not easy, but present. And the bowl near the boy's hands was empty before she had finished her cup of water. She rose and cleared the table. She did not remark on the bowl. She set it in the basin with the others and poured a thin stream of water over them and let them sit. Behind her, she heard the bench slide back, heard the boy's feet on the boards, and then heard him go to the far corner where his blanket was folded over the arm of a chair. She kept her back to him and washed them slowly, one at a time. The man stayed at the table. She could feel him there, not watching her particularly, just remaining. When she had dried the last bowl and hung the cloth, she turned and he was looking at the candle the way she had been looking at it earlier. Not at anything, really, just giving his eyes somewhere to rest. She sat back down across from him. After a while, he said quietly that the boy had not eaten at supper in some time. She said she had wondered. He nodded once. He did not explain further. She did not ask him to. From the corner came the sound of the blanket being pulled close. Then quiet. She looked at the table between her hands. The wood was old and worn smooth in the center where years of plates had crossed it, and the grain ran in a long pale line from one end to the other, like something mapped. She ran her thumb along it without thinking. He watched her do it. She stopped. He said still quietly that she did not have to stay up, that she had been working since before light. She said she knew. She did not move. Outside, the wind had gone down. The gap under the door was silent now, and the room had settled into the particular stillness that comes after a house has been fed and banked, and everyone in it has stopped moving. She could hear the boys breathing from the corner, slow, regular, the breathing of a child actually asleep, not pretending. She looked at the candle. It was burning the same as before, thin and even and without any trouble at all. She stayed because the candle was still burning, and because leaving felt like something she had not decided yet. He did not speak again for a while. He was sitting with his forearms on the table and his hands loosely together, the way a man sits when he has stopped needing to do anything with them. The stove popped once. The boy's breathing held its slow rhythm from the corner. She asked him, after a time, how long the boy had gone without eating before she came. He looked at his hands. He said 3 weeks of not much. Before that some, he said it without weight, the way a man reports a fact he has already spent considerable time inside of. She said 3 weeks was a long time. He said it was. She wanted to ask what the boy had been eating instead, or what had passed for eating, but she did not. She could fill in the shape of it well enough. Bread held out like an offering. A child's mouth pressed closed. The particular silence of a table where someone is missing and no one knows how to say so. She thought of the biscuits. How he had held the third one in both hands and eaten it carefully, like something that might be taken from him. She said, without looking up, that he had eaten well tonight. He said yes. She said she thought he would again tomorrow. He did not answer right away. When he did, he said he hoped so. And there was something underneath the words that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. The sound of a man who had stopped, expecting things and was finding slowly that expectation was becoming possible again without his full permission. The candle had burned down a quarter of an inch since she had last looked at it. She thought about the morning, what she would need from the store, whether the flour was enough or whether she would have to make do. There was a piece of salt pork she had set aside and some dried apples that might do something useful if she cooked them long enough. She was already arranging the hours in her mind. The fire first, then water, then the salt pork with onion if there were onions, and the boy could sit near the stove while it came together. She noticed she was thinking of him as part of the morning, not as a problem to be solved, but as a fact to be arranged around, the way you arrange around a table or a window or anything that is simply where it is. She did not know what to do with that. She set it aside. She looked at the grain of the table, the long, pale line running its full length. Outside, somewhere down the street, a horse shifted in its stall. One clean sound and then nothing. She did not move. She was up before the light changed. The fire took on the third attempt, and she held her hands near the grate for a moment longer than she needed to. The kitchen was cold in the particular way of early mornings in late autumn. Not bitter yet, but with a sharpness that found the spaces between things. She checked the flour. It was enough, barely, if she was careful. The salt pork went in first, with a little water, and what was left of the onion, which was most of it. The dried apples she soaked in a tin cup she set near the back of the stove where the heat was slow and even. She had learned that dried fruit wanted patience more than it wanted heat. You could not hurry it into softness. You had to let it remember what it had been. She heard him before she saw him. A small sound from the hallway, not a footstep exactly, more the absence of one, the careful way a child moves when he is not sure of his welcome. She did not turn around. She moved the spoon in the pot and said, without looking, that there was a stool by the stove if he was cold. A long pause. Then the sound of the stool being pulled an inch closer to the heat. She did not make anything of it. She kept her attention on the pot and the slow work of the morning, and he sat near the warmth and did not speak, and that was all right. It occurred to her that this was perhaps what he needed. Not to be asked anything, not to be watched, only to be in a room where something good was being made, and no one required him to account for himself. The apples had softened by the time the light came through the window properly. She spooned some into a bowl with a little of the cooking water, which had gone sweet and dark, and set it on the table. She went back to the stove. She heard the sound of the spoon against the bowl, tentative at first, and then less so. She did not look. She thought about the bread she would make later if there was time, and the way the morning was taking shape around the two of them, and the sound of the pot, and the light coming in at a low angle across the floor, and catching the dust that floated in the air the way dust always does in a house that is lived in. The bowl was empty when she collected it. She set it in the basin without comment. Outside the window, the street was beginning to wake. A door, a voice, the slow creak of a wagon somewhere past the corner. Another day, assembling itself out of its parts. She started on the bread. The bread took most of the morning. She worked the dough the way she always had, methodically, without hurry, turning it against the board until it held the right resistance beneath her palms. The boy had not left. She had expected him to disappear back into whatever part of the house or yard he usually occupied, but he stayed at the table with his hands folded in front of him, watching. Not watching her, exactly. Watching the process. The way the dough moved, the flour clouding up and settling, the small adjustments she made without appearing to think about them. She punched the dough down and set it to rise near the stove. She washed her hands. He was still there. She did not make anything of it. She went to the shelf for the tin of dried beans she had noticed 2 days before and began sorting through them, picking out the shriveled ones, setting them to the side. It was the kind of work that asked nothing of the hands and very little of the mind, and she did it in the same unhurried way she did everything. After a while, he said, "She used to let me help." She kept her eyes on the beans. "With the bread?" "With everything," he said. She sorted out 3 more bad beans. Outside, someone called to someone else across the street. A name, and then a question about lumber, and then nothing. "You can help tomorrow," she said, "if you want." He did not answer, but he also did not leave. When the bread came out of the oven in the early afternoon, she set it on the board to cool and cut a heel off one end while it was still warm, which was the only piece worth eating before the loaf had settled. She set it on a small plate and put it on the table. She went back to her work. She heard him pick it up. She heard him eat it in the careful way that a boy eats something he does not want anyone to notice he wants. The plate was still on the table when the man came in near dusk, sawdust on his shirt and his hat in his hand. He looked at the plate. He looked at the boy. The boy was sitting in the chair by the window, with a piece of leather cord he had found somewhere, working a slow knot into it without any clear purpose. The man set his hat on the hook by the door. He said nothing about the plate. He washed his hands at the basin. She set supper on the table, beans, bread, the last of the smoked pork, and they sat down together, all 3 of them. in the way that people sit down together when they have not yet agreed that it is a habit, but are letting it become one anyway. The boy did not speak at supper, but he ate. That was the thing she noted without noting it aloud. He ate steadily, and without the performance of reluctance he had carried through the first weeks, and when the bread came around, he took a second piece, which he also did not acknowledge, simply pulled it toward him and broke it the way his father broke bread, along the grain rather than across it. She saw the man see it. He said nothing. He looked at his plate and continued eating, but there was something different in the way he held himself, not loose exactly, but less braced, as if he had been waiting for something and had stopped waiting without being sure why. After supper, the boy took his leather cord to the porch. She could see him through the window, sitting on the top step in the last of the light, still working the knot. She did not know what the knot was meant to be. She did not ask. The man stayed at the table with his coffee. She washed the plates at the basin, and he sat. And the quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It was simply what the evening was. He said, after a long pause, that the porch step on the left side had started to give. She said she had noticed. He said he would see to it this weekend, if the weather held. She said that would be fine, that was all. She set the last plate on the shelf and dried her hands on the cloth that hung from the nail beside the basin. He was looking at the window, at the shape of the boy on the step. She said, without planning to, that he had eaten the heel of the bread before supper. The man turned. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at things he was trying to understand the construction of, careful, unhurried. She had not meant it as anything. It was simply a fact, and she had said it. He looked back at the window. The boy was still working the cord in his slow way, and the light was going orange and flat across the porch boards. The man said quietly that the boy's mother used to cut him the heel. She did not respond to that. There was nothing to respond to. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down again without drinking from it. Outside, the boy stood from the step and looked out at the road that ran west past the edge of town. He stood there for a long moment, not going anywhere, just looking. Then he turned and came back inside, letting the screen door fall shut behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. No one had quite finished speaking. The boy came back inside and went to the table without being called. She had not set supper yet. She was still at the window with her hands around her cup, and the man was still in the chair beside the stove. Neither of them moved to make anything happen. The boy sat down, pushed a button across the table's surface with one finger, watched it fall off the edge, and then folded his hands in his lap and waited. She set the cup down and went to the stove. There was salt pork and the last of the turnips, and a pan of cornbread she had put together that afternoon. She cut the heel from the cornbread without thinking about what she was doing. She was thinking about the pork, whether it had cooked through, whether the boy would take turnips if she put them beside the pork rather than mixed in. She carried the plate to the table and set it in front of him. The heel was at the top of the plate. The boy looked at it. He did not look at her. He looked at the plate, and then at his hands, and then he picked up his fork. He ate, not everything, not the turnips, but the pork and both pieces of cornbread, the heel first, and he drank his water without being reminded, and when he was done, he carried his plate to the dry sink and set it there carefully, the way she had shown him the first week when he had dropped one, and they had both stood looking at the pieces on the floor. The man watched all of this from the chair. She moved back to the stove and stood with her back to the room, adjusting things that did not need adjusting, keeping herself occupied with the practical. She heard the man push back his chair. She heard him say something to the boy too low for her to catch. She heard the boy's footsteps on the stairs, slow and even, not reluctant the way they sometimes were. Then there was just the sound of the fire and the man crossing the kitchen floor. He stopped at the far end of the counter. Not close. He picked up the coffee pot, found it empty, and set it back down. She turned to take it and heat more water and found him standing still, his hand still on the pot's handle, not looking at her, but not looking away either. Somewhere between. She waited. He said it was a good thing she had done. The heel. She said she had not thought about it. She said she was just cutting the bread. He nodded once. He let go of the coffee pot. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the sign above the livery was knocking in its slow way, back and forth, the way things do when they have been hanging a long time and learned not to fight the weather. He went to bed not long after. She heard his boots on the stairs, the particular weight of him, the way the third step from the top had started to give, and he had not yet fixed it. He would fix it. She had learned that about him. He noticed things in a particular order, not by urgency, but by some interior logic she had stopped trying to map. The step would be solid before the first snow. She was certain of that the way she was certain of very little else. She stayed down a while longer. She banked the fire and wiped down the counter and hung the damp cloth to dry. She did these things without hurrying. The kitchen settled around her, the way a room does when it has been worked in and is allowed to rest. She took the candle to the window. She did not know why, exactly. The wind had let up some. The livery sign had gone quiet. The street was empty and dark except for the light in the window above the saloon, which burned at all hours and had nothing to do with her. She stood there for a while. In the spring, a woman from the north end of town had told her she was brave coming out here the way she had. She had thanked her and moved on. She had not thought of herself as brave. She had thought of herself as someone who had needed to be somewhere, and had gotten there. The rest had been one morning after another. That was still true. Only the mornings had changed shape. She set the candle on the sill. She did not think about whether anyone could see it. She just left it there, the way she had gotten in the habit of leaving things. The extra cup, the mended button, the heel of bread, without announcement, without expectation of anything particular in return. She went upstairs. The boy's door was closed, a thin line of darkness underneath it. She paused a moment in the hall, listening. Nothing but the even quiet of someone sleeping without worry. She put her hand flat on the door, very briefly, and then she moved on. His door was open an inch. She did not push it. She walked to her own room and set the candle down, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a moment, her hands in her lap. Outside, the wind came back, just for a moment, just enough to knock the sign once, twice, and then let it hang still. She lay down. She thought about nothing in particular. She thought about the bread, about the way the boy had held out his hand for the heel without looking at her, only at the loaf, and taken what was given. She closed her eyes. The candle burned low on the sill downstairs. It had been burning there a long time,